Good afternoon, everyone. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 35 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to Standing Order 108, subsection 2, and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, February 12th, 2026, the committee is meeting on the review of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I would ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines on the cards on the table. These measures are put in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. You'll also notice a QR code on the card which links to a short awareness video. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. I would now like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour. We have Dr. Scott Simon, full professor, School of Sociological and Anthropological Studies, Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Ottawa. Welcome. Jonathan Berkshire Miller, Senior Fellow, Macdonald Laurier Institute, and from the Asia Pacific Foundation, Veena Najibullah, Vice President, Research and Strategy. Up to 5 minutes will be provided for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions from members. I now invite Dr. Scott to make an opening statement of no more than 5 minutes. Welcome. Thank you.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur Président.
Thank you very much, Chair, members of the committee.
Here today, the geopolitical context has changed drastically since the Indo-Pacific strategy was written, but fundamental realities remain, including challenges related to China, as evidenced by China's external aggression and internal oppression of minorities. Japan, Canada's very close partner, is very clear about the source of threats as documented in its annual defense report. Canada's strategy prioritizes Japan. In March, our prime ministers announced a comprehensive strategic partnership. One result is Canada's participation with Japan, the Philippines, and other partners in the Balikatan maritime exercise this spring. This is not unrelated to Taiwan, which is 111 kilometers from Japan's Yonaguni Island. The IPS promised to grow ties with Taiwan while supporting its resilience. Taiwan is crucial to our economic security as a supplier of advanced semiconductors, contributing to industries from AI in Vancouver to automobiles in Ontario. Canada and Taiwan signed a foreign investment arrangement in 2023, and a bilateral trade agreement awaits final signature. Since 2022, China has conducted 6 large-scale military exercises around Taiwan, including missiles launched into Japan's EEZ. China's military now repeatedly crosses the median line between China and Taiwan. China has also escalated incursions into Japanese waters and airspace. China is conducting a global campaign accusing Japan of resurrecting neo-militarism and threatening regional security. This year, China implemented new sanctions against Japan, including export controls on rare earths. It sanctioned Keiji Furuya, head of a parliamentary friendship association, for visiting Taiwan. Last month, China denounced Japan at the UN Security Council for a Taiwan Strait transit. China dismisses international appeals for peace and threatens countries that provide even moral support to democratic Taiwan. China coerces Canada. Last month, Envoy Wang Di warned that our strategic partnership would be damaged if Canada keeps sending warships through the Taiwan Strait and parliamentarians to Taiwan. China wants Canada to treat Taiwan as a red line that should never be crossed, but if we obey this new request, we would diverge from our own policy that since 1970 takes note of China's claim while neither endorsing nor challenging it. Compliance would make Canada complicit in suppressing Taiwan. The Taiwan Strait, 126 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, is an international waterway. Canadian warships transited 11 times since 2018. To put that into perspective, Chinese warships passed through the Tsugaru Strait, which is 20 kilometers at its narrowest point between Hokkaido and Honshu. Parliamentary visits from Canada to Taiwan began in 1974, and a friendship group was established in 1982. Because legislators represent their constituents, parliamentary visits are people-to-people ties that neither endorse nor challenge China's claims. China is not a market economy, and their non-market policies and practices undermine the foundation of a global free trade system. China's strategy is to flood the world's markets with cheap products enabled by heavy subsidies and to dominate strategic industrial sectors. We must protect our industries, jobs for Canadians if we are to prosper for the rest of the century. Canada's Indo-Pacific presence requires pragmatic realism, clarity about which states uphold our freedom, prosperity, and shared values versus those that threaten our collective security. We must choose between a free and open Pacific or great power coercion. I have 4 suggestions to present today. 1, Canada should publicly support Japan, pushing back against China's unfounded accusations while addressing sanctions by strengthening supply chains. 2, Canada should continue and strengthen defense and security collaboration with Japan, informing our own population about its importance to Canada. 3, Canada should strengthen its commitment to supporting Taiwan's resilience. We must continue both Taiwan Strait transits and interparliamentary diplomacy. We should not delay completion of the bilateral trade cooperation framework agreement. And finally, 4, Canada should work with allies and friends to address the non-market policies and practices of China and should avoid becoming an economic enabler for China even as it pursues its own export interests. Thank you for your attention. Merci.
I now invite Mr. Miller to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair, and members of the committee for the opportunity to appear before you. Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy was, at its launch in 2022, a necessary, in my view, a necessary and overdue step, aligning Canadian foreign policy with the world's most consequential region. The task now, in my view, is not to rewrite the IPS, but to refresh it, building on its strengths while adapting it to a more complex and interconnected strategic environment. One area for refinement is the strategy's framing of that environment. The IPS was designed at a time when it was still possible, at least conceptually, to think of regions and policy domains as more distinct than they are today. That is no longer the case, simply no longer the case. Geographically, the threats that Canada faces are increasingly interconnected across the Indo-Pacific, the transatlantic, and the Arctic. Russia's war in Ukraine is not confined to Europe. It is sustained by Chinese economic support and North Korean materiel, while Moscow continues to project power in the Pacific and the Arctic. China, for its part, is now a self-declared near-Arctic state, investing in infrastructure, research, and dual-use capabilities that have direct implications for Canada's northern security. Meanwhile, Indo-Pacific partners like Japan and South Korea are more deeply engaged in NATO discussions than ever before. These are not separate theaters. They are part of a single evolving strategic system. Canada is uniquely positioned, in my view, at the intersection of these spaces, but that position requires a more integrated approach. The IPS and a refresh of the IPS should more explicitly connect Canada's Indo-Pacific engagement with its transatlantic and Arctic regions, ensuring that policy, planning, and resource allocation reflect the reality of these linkages. Equally important is the need to move beyond the long-standing and increasingly outdated distinction between economic and security policy. For too long, Canadian policy has operated on the assumption that trade, investment, and economic engagement can be pursued largely in isolation from national security considerations. That assumption is no longer tenable. Economic relations are now a primary vector of strategic competition. Supply chains can be leveraged for coercion. Investment flows can create dependencies with security implications. Critical technologies, whether in telecommunications, artificial intelligence, or critical minerals, sit at the intersection of economic opportunity and national security risk. The idea that Canada can engage economically without accounting for these dynamics is not simply outdated, it is strategically unsound. A refreshed IPS should explicitly reject this false bifurcation. Economic policy must be understood as security policy. This does not, of course, mean disengagement. It means discipline. It means ensuring that diversification strategies enhance resilience rather than simply shifting exposure. It means aligning investment screening, export controls, and industrial policy with trusted partners, and it means being clear-eyed about the risks inherent in deeper economic integration with actors whose strategic interests may diverge from our own. Within this broader context, the IPS would also benefit from greater clarity in its approach to China. The strategy rightly adopted a balanced framework, in my view, recognizing China as a disruptive actor, but also one we need to engage with through dialogue and confined cooperation. China's actions, from coercive behavior in maritime domains, as Dr. Simon mentioned, to economic retaliation, to growing military pressure in the Taiwan Strait, have become defining features of the regional security landscape. Canada should and must respond with a posture that is steady, principled, and predictable, competing where necessary, cooperating where possible, and defending its interests without hesitation. This is particularly important in the context of Taiwan. Canada's long-standing position in support of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is sound, but too often implemented with excessive caution. There remains a tendency to self-censor engagement with Taiwan in an effort to preempt negative reactions from Beijing. Over time, this risks creating a pattern of incremental concession that is neither required by policy nor aligned with Canada's interests. So in closing, just a few recommendations I'll give. First, Canada should reinforce the IPS's continuity across political cycles through formal mechanisms and signal long-term commitment. Second, Canada should continue to focus its security contributions on areas of comparative advantage, including maritime domain awareness, cyber capabilities, and specialized training. Fourth, economic diversification, and this is an important one. Efforts should be deepened with an emphasis on resilience and shared interests, ensuring that new partnerships are structured with security considerations in mind. In closing, the IPS remains a strong foundation for Canada's engagement in the Indo-Pacific. The next stage is about refinement and action, ensuring that the strategy reflects the interconnected nature of today's threats in the inseparability of economic and security policies and the need for a consistent approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We go next to Ms. Najibullah.
Great. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. I have submitted a longer written statement with 13 recommendations, so I will use my opening remarks to make 5 broad points. First, the Indo-Pacific strategy on balance has delivered real progress. Canada is more present, more visible, and more connected to regional networks than at any time in recent memory. But presence is a means, not an end. The test now is whether Canada can turn its expanded presence in the region into real gains for Canadian prosperity, security, and influence. Second, the strategy has made a real difference, but the world has changed substantially since its launch. The government, therefore, should move quickly towards an Indo-Pacific strategy phase 2. This should be an evolution, not a reinvention. We should not be starting from scratch, but the next phase of the strategy should be revised to have fewer priorities, additional dedicated resources, and clearer measurable outcomes. Economic resilience should be its organizing logic. Diversification in particular should not simply mean more trade or more experts. It should mean deeper and more resilient Canadian positions in critical supply chains, such as around energy, critical minerals, clean technology, AI, and quantum. Third, the China and Taiwan chapters need to be updated. We've heard a lot about that already, but let me just note that the IPS identified China as an increasingly disruptive global power. That assessment holds true today. But while the diagnosis remains relevant, Canada's approach to managing relations with China must evolve to reflect the broader shifts in the global order and our priority on independence and room for maneuver. The government's recalibration towards selective engagement with China is necessary, but selective engagement cannot become quiet accommodation. It must not mean political acquiescence, self-censorship, or softening of Canada's own values, rules, and laws. It must be interest-based, disciplined, and bounded by clear guardrails, and the guardrails have to be specific and deal with issues of foreign interference, transnational repression, forced labor, cyber threats, investment screening, research security on sensitive technologies, as well as critical infrastructure, data governance, and supply chain integrity. We need that level of disaggregated guardrails. Canada's substantive relationship with Taiwan should not be reduced or treated as a bargaining chip in our recalibration with China. Canada's One China policy provides ample room for practical engagement with Taiwan, and that space should be used with confidence. Canada should move forward with practical cooperation, including by signing the long-negotiated trade facilitation arrangement and continue Taiwan's trade transit with allies and partners as part of our broader commitment to international law, freedom of navigation, and regional stability. And we should make such transits public. Fourth, the next phase of the strategy needs a much stronger language around energy, technology, and services agenda. Canada can be more relevant to the Indo-Pacific if it is seen as a reliable provider of both conventional and clean energy. LNG, NPG, uranium, critical minerals, all of these should be treated not only as commercial opportunities, but as strategic assets. Energy security can be a lever of Canadian influence and relevance in the region. The strategy should also elevate digital trade and services, as well as university and research and technology partnerships. Too much of Canada's Indo-Pacific economic conversation still focuses on exports of goods. These are essential, but many of the fastest growing opportunities are in services, digital infrastructure, AI, quantum, education, as well as research partnerships and talent mobility. Canada's universities and colleges are strategic assets in the region and should be treated that way. Fifth, the Indo-Pacific strategy must be linked to a broader Canadian foreign policy strategy, national security strategy, and Canada's domestic economic resilience. Canada's regional and thematic strategies cannot sit as separate boxes. The Indo-Pacific strategy, the Arctic policy, the Africa strategy, various development policies, they all need to serve a common purpose. Finally, implementation should be measured by outcomes, not activity. Meetings, missions, announcements matters only if they produce results. The government should publish an annual IPS scorecard that measures market access secured, investments attracted, supply chains strengthened, security capabilities delivered, partnerships institutionalized, and regulatory barriers removed. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy helped Canada show up in the region. The next phase must ensure that Canada matters as a relevant, effective, and consequential partner in the region that will shape Canada's prosperity, security, and sovereignty for decades to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your statement. We go next to questions from members, beginning with MP Michael Chong. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing today. Taking note of all your opening comments, about the fact that Japan has been prioritized in the Indo-Pacific strategy, comments about the need for more interconnectivity between the different pillars in the Indo-Pacific strategy, and also your comments about the need to not engage in quiet accommodation, but to robustly indicate what we stand for as a country. I wanted to talk about, focus on the importance of peace and security in the region as a foundation for trade and investment. The Government of Canada has talked a lot about the need to diversify trade and investment into the region. I think it'd be interesting to hear your perspectives on how important is it to maintain peace and stability in the region and to ensure that the PRC does not take unilateral action in whatever form it takes against Taiwan.
Anyone in particular?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Najibullah.
Happy to start. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's absolutely critical for Canada to be seen as a stakeholder in the stability of the region and not just a distant actor interested in trade and exports of goods. And right now, especially given the questions around U.S. Continued presence in the region, I think it's even more important for Canada, along with Japan, Australia, and many Southeast Asian countries, South Korea, to do more together. Canada, of course, cannot be the major provider of hardware and a lot of resources, but we can be a very consequential provider of niche technologies, especially when it comes to things like maritime domain awareness. For instance, our dark vessel detection program, which has been much celebrated. It's something that we're bringing to the region, and that needs to continue. Canada can also also, in addition to providing those niche technologies, can also be an important actor in defense diplomacy, in being able to stand firm on principles that matter to us in terms of freedom of navigation, in terms of calling out actions that are violating our partners and allies in the region. So my answer would be that there's no way for us to engage economically without also being seen as a stakeholder in the stability of the region.
You say that your recommendation that Canada not engage in quiet accommodation is reflected in the actions of heads of government such as those of Japan and the Philippines. I take note that in November of last year, Prime Minister Takachi of Japan said very plainly that if the PRC were to take unilateral action against Taiwan, such as a naval blockade or a military action, that this could constitute a, quote, survival threatening situation, end quote, and an existential crisis for Japan. What she essentially was saying there is that under Japanese law, Japan's military would be activated to respond to the PRC threat against Taiwan. Just last week, the Philippine president made similar comments. Do you see that as an embodiment, as an example of clearly stating a country's position in the Indo-Pacific region as a way to ensure peace and stability in the region, to make it clear to the PRC about the high cost of any unilateral action?
I'll start, but I'll invite my colleagues to reply as well. I think both the Prime Minister of Japan and also now the President of Philippines are stating facts, Mr. Chair. They are essentially observing what's happening in the region, and they are calling out those developments. It so happens then that PRC sees that as an escalation, and there's coercion in response to that. But in the face of that kind of coercion and bullying, we have two choices. We can basically back down, or we can continue to speak truth and continue to mobilize, because there's an importance of the domestic audience here. I was in Philippines at the time that President Marcos made that comment. It speaks to the domestic audience even more so than the international audience, being able to recognize the actual threat environment and what's at stake, and making sure that the population is not naive about the security environment.
I guess maybe I'll reframe the question. Do you paradoxically believe that comments, public comments, rather than quiet accommodation, made by the Prime Minister of Japan and by the President of the Philippines actually increases the long-term chances of peace and stability in the region? Or do you think, because you would seem to suggest that through your recommendation that there not be quiet accommodation?
I think there's a balance for both. So there's obviously room for diplomacy and making sure that there are channels for communication and as much trust as built as possible. And certainly Japan and Philippines and others, being much closer to China, have spent decades developing those mechanisms. But sometimes there's also an important role for democratically elected leaders to speak honestly in their own parliaments with their own populations. And I think both have to happen. Sometimes that creates friction, and we have to manage that. But I think there is a line between sort of performative statements, visits that get too much attention, for instance, visits of high-profile individuals to Taiwan. Arguably, that can be seen as escalatory. But making statements within your own parliament or to your own population that is simply factual, I think should not be seen in the same way. But there's a balance between megaphone diplomacy and trust building.
Just very quickly, I would agree with everything that Veena mentioned, but I would say that China in particular took advantage of this opportunity of Prime Minister Takaichi's comments. This is not a change in Japan's policy. This was a comment that was made that actually is not about intervening in a Taiwan contingency to potentially get involved with the PRC, but actually to protect its alliance and its alliance structure with the United States. So in Japan's laws, it has to protect its alliance. This is called collective self-defense. So China knows this very well and took advantage of those comments for its own purposes. And to your first question on peace and security and where that falls, I think it's a prerequisite. So if you think of a poker game and you put your ante in, you have to be talking about peace and security in this part of the world. And that's why I mentioned in my opening comments that you can't bifurcate this. It doesn't mean securitizing everything, but you cannot walk into Seoul, Hanoi, Tokyo, Taipei, wherever, and just talk about economy anymore. Security is baseline. And I think that is a baseline understanding. It's been that way for a while, and I think that if we expect economic dividends and trade dividends, we have to be there for the national security side. yes, we don't have the same size of a military as the United States, but there are other ways that we can do that.
Thank you. We go next to Rob Oliver.
Time on that last round.
We were over by 50 seconds.
50, about a
Yeah.
minute, I thought. Okay,
Yeah,
just
because
want to
the-
make sure that we
No, he
share.
was actually ahead of schedule, but the
I just
last,
want to make sure we share the minute.
No, absolutely.
I need an hour with you of my own. I want to cut through a little bit of the coded language that all three of you used. It was guarded and coded, and you've all mentioned geopolitical changes, a new environment. What are you talking about? Please, would you, I would like each of you three to name what you really see the changes are since the IPS was launched. Name names if you need to.
I can go first very quickly, but just, I mean, the first most principal thing is Russia's revisionism and its war in Ukraine. Of course, the war started before the launch of the IPS, but we've seen a deepening of that conflict. We've seen a deepening of the relationship between Russia and the PRC, not only with the PRC, China supporting Russia's invasion in Ukraine, but also joint exercises in the Pacific side of it. So that's one side, is just the deteriorating security environment and the transatlantic and how that impacts the Indo-Pacific partners. The second part of this is when we talk about Asia, it seems that we're only talking about China, but we also have other disruptive actors. We have North Korea, which I mentioned in my opening statement. We're seeing a greater convergence there between Russia, China, and North Korea. And we're seeing, I think, a very troubling sign between Russia, which is still a Pacific state, and its relationship with North Korea. So we're seeing multi-vectors of a challenging security environment. And while there may not be a great conflict in the Indo-Pacific right now, the tensions are quite significant across the spectrum.
Yeah, so I would agree with it, but I want to add a few things here because I think that there are a number of things going on since 2022. The first and most obvious one is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but the second one is the situation ever since October 7th when the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and then there's the question of Iran and the Hormuz Strait, which I think shows us the danger of a conflict in a very important waterway like this. The Taiwan Strait would be a much more serious situation, which is why it is an existential issue for Canada that peace and security be preserved in that region. And then finally, of course, there's the election of Donald Trump to President of the United States. And some of the things that he has done is, for example, around Ukraine, are of concern. And I think that there are a lot of issues about trust with Donald Trump, and I think that is an issue for until the next election. That being said, the people in power in Russia and China will be there for a much longer time.
Sovereignty
That's right.
and our prosperity
Absolutely.
and our resilience.
Absolutely.
So that is what I thought you were talking about, but
Yes, that is
Bertram
what we
Miller
were
didn't
talking.
bring
That is what I was talking
And,
about. yeah.
and Rena.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. For me, it is fundamentally about the changes that have happened in the U.S., the election of President Trump, and the fundamental change to the way U.S. exercises its power, its relationship with its allies, obviously the change in the Canada-U.S. relationship, which is necessitating a new approach to foreign policy by Canada, but also the change to alliances more generally. We're seeing it much more immediately in Europe, but that change is also coming to the Indo-Pacific. So the lack of reliance on the U.S. alliance structure globally, but also in the Indo-Pacific, and the way now Canada has to exercise its own foreign policy from a perspective of gaining strategic autonomy and diversifying and reducing its over-reliance does necessitate that we have a new look at how the Indo-Pacific strategy is positioned. It came at a time of the Biden administration and at a time when alliance structure was its strongest in many, many years. We're no longer there.
Our committee just traveled to Washington, and we were there when President Trump went to China. What is your read on that relationship, which is full of hostile rhetoric? However, in the practice, we see something quite different than the hostile rhetoric. And I'm just wondering your takes on it. Could start with, go in reverse order.
I'll start. I think the most important outcome of that summit was this new framing of the U.S.-China relationship as a constructive strategic stability. Now, China would like to make this as a long-term strategic shift, which essentially establishes a peer relationship on China's terms. There are many in the U.S. administration that are hoping that this is a tactical moment, putting President Trump aside because it's difficult to interpret and understand what might be happening for him. But many in the administration see this as a tactical moment of stability, which both sides will use to reinforce their own positions and to be able to have more self-reliance and de-risking, which means then for the rest of us, it's also a moment where we need to focus on our own resilience and our own strength. The relationship will likely be more stable for the foreseeable future, but let's not mistake it for the fact that the structural issues have been resolved. They have not.
Yeah. So if I can add to that, I think there's reason to be concerned about some of the comments that Trump has made about Taiwan, about him delaying the sale of arms to Taiwan, and saying that those 1982 six assurances of Reagan, that was a long time ago. And so I think that there are reasons to believe that Trump cannot be trusted on this file. And so I think we have to be aware of that, and that's why we need more Canada.
Chair Miller.
I would just say, I would agree with this G2 framing is that this was a nightmare for many countries that are U.S. allies in the region, that the U.S. would acquiesce to this framing of a G2, of two great powers, the U.S. and China. And clearly, I think some of the atmospherics from this summit lead to that impression. The silver lining of this and the caveat for those who are more concerned about that is that I do think the U.S., there's multiple actors in the U.S. Of course, there's Congress, there's Senate, there's different policy actors. I'm not convinced in the long term that some of the transactions that were made or appear to be made at that summit will be long lasting. I think there's deep China skepticism in Washington. And actually, I mean, if you want to take an example of this, the freedom of navigation operation that just happened in the South China Sea, what was it, about a couple of weeks after the summit in China. So I think that there's examples that the United States is not going to abandon all of its activities that are meant to deter Chinese adventurism in the region, and I think that will continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We go next to Monsieur Duceppe, 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur Miller,
Thank you, Chair. To the three witnesses, you've made points that are very important. When we set out an Indo-Pacific strategy, we have to be thinking, first of all, of security. I think, sir, that you spoke about international trade, but we have to keep national security in mind foremost. There was an agreement for 49,000 Chinese EVs in exchange for a drop in the canola tariff. Do you think that there should be a change in the policy? Should, for example, should we not have the EVs enter Canada because we're afraid that the cameras that are on board will capture information and data that will go back to Peking, back to China? There are agencies that have worked in the defense area that have expressed concerns. It's a sensitive issue. So you are experts in cybersecurity, sir. Should Canada prohibit commercial trade with China on the basis of national security? This is a very disquieting concern. What do you think the government's action should be when you look at it and when you look at the interests of the Chinese Communist Party? My question is for Mr. Miller first and then the others.
Excellent question. Let me try to be very brief on it. I think on the technical side of it, I think it's something we should be looking very closely at. It's something that is concerning me quite a bit, is the potential that these vehicles could have elements that could be used for espionage and other purposes. I think there's another element of this, though, is looking at what is the plan post 47,000 cars. So the idea that we need to make a transaction to get something else without a long-term plan on where are we going forward, for example, with future potential imports of Chinese EVs, I think is a challenging thing that I haven't heard a whole lot of articulation articulation on. The third and final point is not minimizing the potential diplomatic costs of this. And one example of this, I will say, is, for example, the relationship with Japan, which we've talked about before. China is Japan's greatest geostrategic rival now, with some of the coercion that China is putting onto Japan. Japan's one of our greatest and most reliable investors in Canada, including in Ontario. I don't think that we want to minimize the potential to just say that we can mitigate that and we can manage that risk. I think increasingly they will be watching moves like this, and that will impact and affect their potential investment flows into Canada.
Merci. Well,
I'll answer in English here, but I think that the electric vehicle issue is very important. I think it's important to underline the fact that we have a choice to make, and we already have a good relationship with automakers from Japan. And so I think we should be deepening our relationship with Japan, which is a democratic ally, and we need to have good, solid security chains with them. And I want to bring up another thing, which is the issue of human rights, because it is unclear how clean the supply chain is that goes into these electric vehicles. And it could be that there is forced labor, that some of these Uyghur people that have been put into forced labor regimes would be involved in that. And I think that we need to stay very clear from even the possibility of that. So that's my main concern. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just one small point to add that, similar to my colleagues, I'm less worried about the 47,000 EVs that might be coming in the first year. I'm much more concerned about what else is being proposed by way of bringing in Chinese production to Canada, as well as China's role in the battery supply chain and even electrification more generally. So I think this is part of a conversation that needs to go beyond that preliminary and provisional agreement. There's been a lot of attention on 47,000 EVs versus canola. To me, that's just one small issue relative to what else is now potentially on the table and the attention that we need to pay to how our economic policies vis-a-vis China will fit into our overall industrial strategy and policies, and what kind of economy Canada wants to have 10, 15 years down the road, whether we want to have a manufacturing sector altogether. Thank you.
merci pour ça, Monsieur
Thank
Simon.
you. Mr. Simon, you brought up an important point because we have heard from the university that there is forced labor that is involved in the preparation of many of these vehicles. Mr. Simon, you talked about the agreement that was almost signed with Taiwan. And Taiwan is a democratic entity that is reliable, trustworthy, and does not use forced labor. But what I was told by representatives of the Department of Foreign Affairs was, and there was a long silence when I put my question, why is this not yet been signed yet? And the fact that it hasn't been signed yet, has that upset Beijing? They took their time and were silent for a long time. So can you tell me clearly if this has had an effect on Beijing? And perhaps it's not the first time that there has been agreements between the UK and Beijing, and rather Taiwan. Yes, this is an important point. Silence. The silence is a forced one. We can't wait. It's very important for Canada to have this done.
You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thanks for the witness for appearing today. If I heard correctly, you also talk about being strategic more than tactical, and we have to walk into the relationship with China with eyes wide open. After the visit of the Prime Minister and the announcement of economic ties, increasing economic ties with China, including the 47,000 EVs into Canada and the other details that we don't know. Do you believe that we are walking into this relationship eyes wide open?
I can start. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the rhetoric is correct in terms of having eyes wide open and having the various guardrails. The issue is going to be implementation and what kind of work is actually underway to make sure that those guardrails exist, to make sure that we have the capacity and the resources to implement them. And some of the early signs are not as encouraging. We've spoken about Taiwan and what happened with the 2 Liberal MPs who got recalled. We've spoken about the Taiwan arrangement for trade that's still on the books. We've spoken about the issue of forced labor and how that has been handled when it comes to China. So I think we have to be careful not to walk into sort of changing pragmatic engagement or selective engagement into basically complete acquiescence to everything that Beijing puts on the table. If the marker of success is that we will have a relationship that has no friction, that we will basically try to manage it quietly, then I think we will be in the dangerous territory, because the red lines will continue to shift and we will be at risk of undermining our own interests and values long term for the sake of short-term economic gain potentially.
Mr. Simon, I'd like you to weigh on this, please.
Yeah, I would like to add something to that because I think there is something that's going to happen very soon which will tell us where this government is heading. And that is that the HMCS Charlottetown has just left Vietnam. And in past years when it's been leaving these exercises in the south, it's gone up through the Taiwan Strait. And so I think we need to watch carefully where the Charlottetown goes in the next 2 weeks. If we see a Taiwan Strait transit, then that's a good sign that the guardrails are there and that the government has its eyes open. But if it makes a detour around the other side of Taiwan or through Japanese waters to get to Korea, then that would send us a sign that Canada is trying to appease China, and that would be very dangerous.
Mr. Miller?
I'll just be very quick, but I agree with my colleagues, and I would say that we need to stop talking in riddles here. Sometimes an example of this is wishing that the status quo doesn't change. The reality is the status quo has changed, is changing every minute, every hour, whether it's in the Taiwan Strait, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's in the East China Sea. So going to this point about clarity of language and consistency is I think we can't take this, the Chinese will always say megaphone diplomacy, but we can't just say we're being quiet diplomacy and actually not talk about these issues. I think we need to be clear and consistent in our policy. And it doesn't mean that we're disruptive and that we don't have a bilateral relationship with China, but I think we need to be very clear about this, and we cannot censor our views when we see activities happening, especially in the maritime domain, which I feel have been quite destabilizing.
Come before economy. I guess there's no economy without security. We've seen examples in multiple places in the past decades and recently. And we know that security issues is not just outside, caused by China, not just outside Canada and in the Indo-Pacific, in the Pacific region, is also in Canada. We still have police stations that operate in Canada, and that really bringing concern to the very Canadian, Chinese, of Chinese descent communities. What do you say? What would you say to the government on the police station? We've questioned this before. I questioned the minister myself on this, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start by noting that it would be important to make sure that the issue of foreign interference remains top of mind. For 2023-2024, because of the Public Commission on Inquiry into Foreign Interference, we had a lot of attention and understanding of what was happening. In the last year, because of everything else that's happening, this issue has gone into the back burner. And I think we cannot afford that because actors who are involved in foreign interference on Canadian soil, be that Russia, China, India, Iran, and others, they're not letting down their guard. We cannot do that either. So we need to move forward in implementing all of the recommendations that exist. We have a good understanding of this issue, and we need to move forward on the implementation. And we cannot afford to put it on the back burner because we now say that other issues are more important. We have to do multiple things at once, and that is one issue that fundamentally touches not just our democratic institutions, but also the safety of Canadians on the Canadian soil.
Thumbs up.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We next go to MP Clark. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for your expertise and your testimony this afternoon. Ms. Najibullah, I wanted to ask you something that stands out from all of your testimony today is the tension or the balance that needs to be struck between issues of economics and issues of security and geopolitics, right? And as a middle power, Canada's problem, if I can put it that way, is always we don't necessarily always have the economic or military might to dictate terms on, especially in a region as large as the Indo-Pacific. So the balance in 2022, but what do we look at now from that balance? And are there areas where we need to recalibrate, in your view, to get that balance, strike that delicate balance?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. I think in my statement and in the recommendations that I've made, I am pointing out that there's a lot that Canada can do, including when it comes to energy. We are middle power, but we actually are much more than a middle power. We're the 10th largest economy. We can be doing more and punching way above the way we're currently engaging in the region. So energy is one of them, as well as things like AI, quantum. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that we're not as vulnerable as some of our partners like Japan, Australia, and others who trade much more with China and are much more integrated into the Chinese supply chain in the region, right? So they're much more open to coercion. Only about 5% of our exports goes to China. We're trying to deepen that, but we have to recognize that we're not as vulnerable to coercion as Japan and Australia and others in the region are. Therefore, we need to be much more confident, show up with confidence, understand what our strengths are, which in energy, both conventional and clean energy, as well as niche technologies. Certainly quantum is an area where we can be really leading right now, and there's a lot of appetite in the region to engage with us. AI, critical minerals. So I guess my point is that yes, it's a challenging moment where we have to do multiple things at once, but we should also really lean in on our strength and make sure that our friends are with us. The conversation shouldn't just be about China. Obviously, China is an important actor, but we should be doing a lot more with Japan, a lot more with Australia. I'm delighted to say that in the last year, there has been much more strategic engagement with Australia than ever before. We might be strategic cousins, but we're not yet strategic partners. And that's something that needs to change right away. So I guess in short, I would say that the tension is there, but Canada is in a much better position than we give ourselves credit for.
Mr. Simon, Mr. Miller, if you want to touch on that as well, briefly as you can. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be very brief about that. I think that Japan is a very important partner here because they are so close. They do have so much trade with China, but yet they're very much aware of the risks. And so I think that we really need to deepen our relationship with Japan. And with all of the issues that we just talked about, I think that it would be a good idea to see how much we can do with Japan, even make it a formal alliance. As we had, 100 years ago, there was the Anglo-Japanese alliance, and I think that we need to go back to something like that, which could include the UK, Australia, and New Zealand.
I'll be very brief too, but I think that Japan, of course, I think is an important partner, but I'd actually point to the Philippines too. And one of the notable developments, I think, recently is Canada signing on to the Luzon Corridor with other like-minded partners, which is about creating and defining secure supply chains on critical minerals, et cetera. So there's a number of different partners that I think we could be working with. It's not the idea of one partner will replace the U.S. or a couple partners will replace the U.S. I think we have to get that notion out of our head. There's ways that we can diversify with like-minded partners, but I think it's about having a couple of these partners that can help our supply chains.
Thank you. And actually, I wanted to touch on another nation that actually hasn't come up yet in the meeting. That's India. Ms. Najibullah, I'm not sure if this was from your submission or not, but you mentioned that there has been some clear achievements on India. I think that's a significant change given where we were in 2022, without saying more than that. So could you just, all of you in the time we have left, about a minute, give us your thoughts on where that relationship sits and how that figures into the broader picture of the region?
I think we are seeing a fundamental reset in the relationship, which is good news and will serve Canada's national interests. It's a relationship that will need to still have a lot of attention. I think the CEPA that we're negotiating, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, will be a really good framework for us to engage with India. We have to be realistic about how much work we still need to do to up our India competence. Basically, picture us where we were with China 15 years ago. That's where we are with India now in terms of our understanding of India's significance in the region, India's rise globally, and our own capacity to engage. So I think it's a relationship that has a lot of complementarity from an economic perspective. It's underutilized. I think CEPA will give us the framework to engage, and we have to do a lot more here at home in dealing with our India competence, but also obviously addressing the difficult issues that still are there on foreign interference and law enforcement.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Duceppe, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Less time for us, always the case. Mr. Simon, we've heard a lot about nation states. I'd like you now to say if it's possible for Canada to do more for Indigenous peoples and what the strategy should be. I believe you know that this interests me deeply. The Indigenous people have a very important place already in the strategy, and I'm very happy to say that there are always exchanges with the Indigenous peoples, Taiwan and the Philippines and Canada. So this is part of the strategy. I have been involved with these exchanges between the nations and Indigenous peoples. Thank you. Today I met with people who represent the Rohingya, and I was struck by this, that there is enormous amount still of human trafficking, and that it involves women and girls that are sent to bordellos, and men and boys that are in the fishing sector. To what extent does the Indo-Pacific strategy take into account that at several areas of this continent that there are people who are pushed into forced labor of some sort? And is Canada doing something that is sufficient, or is it insufficient to stop this forced labor? Madame Najibul.
Mr. Chair. I think as part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, we are doing more in the region in collaboration with law enforcement, including on the issues that you raised, especially in Southeast Asia when it comes to Myanmar and other parts. It's part of the review of the strategy. There will need to be consideration about how the strategy will be organized, its various pillars, and where these issues will come in, because there's obviously the law enforcement partnerships that various departments are engaged in, but there's also the developmental component in supporting those communities. There's also the humanitarian relief component that was part of the strategy, and that would need to be a decision by the government in terms of what kind of priorities will be allocated in the next phase. But I can say that in the first phase of IPS, there has been programming, including in Southeast Asia, around those issues.
Mais est-ce que dans sa stratégie Indo-Pacifique...
Yes, but shouldn't Canada in its IPS put more teeth into what it is negotiating with respect to the entry into our territory? Should that not be part of the Indo-Pacific strategy?
Mr. Chair, you're saying what kind of provisions we will have to prevent trafficking into Canada, law enforcement trafficking. It would be obviously up to the government. My own advice would be not to bring that into the Indo-Pacific strategy, but rather have it as part of an overall understanding of how the strategy connects to foreign policy and domestic priorities.
Thank you. Next, we go to MP Michael Chong, 5 minutes.
Yeah. So we're talking about the Indo-Pacific, the government's approach to the Indo-Pacific. This week, the PRC's foreign minister will be in town. What would your advice be to the government about what should be brought up in the bilateral between Canada's foreign minister and the PRC's foreign minister? Each of you, please.
I get tagged with. So I would say that, again, going back to my consistency point, that we think about what are some of the interests that I think we've outlined in the Indo-Pacific, and I think we've talked about some of our support for like-minded democracies, our support, for example, for the arbitral ruling in the South China Sea, some of the operations that we're taking in the region, I think that some of my colleagues mentioned. And I'm not saying that we throw those in the face of the Chinese foreign minister when he's here, but by no means do I think that we backtrack on them. So I think that's one important part, is that we can't be meek and let the agenda be framed by the Chinese side. The second point that I would say, too, and I think a lot of us remember maybe famously or infamously what happened last time the Chinese foreign minister was here visiting, is I don't think that we can allow things like that to happen in our democracy. Perhaps he's learned his lesson, but I think that that's an example of something that I hope does not happen.
You're referencing when he berated a Canadian journalist?
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you.
Exactly.
Sure. My understanding of this visit, Mr. Chair, is that it's about building trust and deepening the new strategic partnership. So I think what will be important, especially in how Canadian government speaks about it publicly, is to not fall into China's rhetoric, PRC's rhetoric. We need to stay strong and clear on what it is that Canada wishes to achieve through this new strategic partnership, and what's in it and what's not in it. Because I think the atmosphere and the mood that the PRC would like to project is that we have completely turned the page and there's absolutely nothing that is an issue, that there are no tensions, there's no disagreements, and there's alignment. And I don't think that is accurate. And the challenge for our government, in my view, will be to advance the interests that they would like to advance while also maintaining strategic clarity on the limits and the guardrails that Canada has, and to not fall into the paradigms and the rhetoric that China will be presenting.
I think it's clear that there's a difference between a strategic partnership and a comprehensive strategic partnership. And so I think that I hope that the meeting goes on smoothly and is cordial on both sides. But it is important for Canada to perhaps outside of the meeting and after the meeting to make it clear to the Canadian public that we want to have a peaceful and continuing relationship with the People's Republic of China, but that we are aware of ongoing problems, including its aggression to neighboring states and also to human rights issues at home. Those are things that we can't bring up realistically with the foreign minister, but those are things that do need to be communicated to the Canadian public.
Thank you, Chair.
We go next to MP Anita Vandervelde, and I understand you're sharing your time with MP Sari. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses. I just have a quick question for you, Ms. Najibullah. You mentioned that there were universities and that this kind of university academic cultural diplomacy is very useful. And I have a constituent, Varavati Monahan, who translated all of Anne of Green Gables into the Thai language. And now Thai universities, through her effort, are actually using it as part of their world literature curriculum. Can you tell us why it would be important for us to support those kinds of efforts?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. That's a great question, and it allows me to share that there are many such examples. Our universities and the fact that so many people have come and studied in Canada, that's a huge asset for Canadian soft power in the region, and we need to do a lot more to properly utilize that, to be much more strategic about that. So much of the discussion has been focused on foreign students. I think that's only one piece of it. The region is really dynamic, and we can be doing a lot more in joint research partnerships. India is an area where this comes out, but also in Southeast Asia. So I think there needs to be much more concerted effort to have a public conversation with Canada about the importance of universities, of the services sector, and the dynamic partnerships that now exist for us in the region, and also the enormous asset that we have through this alumni network of people who have studied in Canada and who are now in all over the region in positions of influence, including in business. So I think this could advance people-to-people tais, but also commercial interests. We can go a long way in attracting investment and business opportunities by utilizing that network as well. Thank you.
Je vais aller dans le même sens, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, I quite agree. In my question, my colleague spoke about diplomatic university diplomacy. That's very important. But I also want to speak to the diaspora. People have come here, and it's important to know how we can work with the diaspora that is here in terms of our ties to the Indo-Pacific.
Chair, for that question. You're absolutely right. We have a tremendous resource. When I speak about Asia competence, obviously a key part of that is cultural and language abilities, and we do have a rich diaspora community, for instance, 1 million strong Filipino-Canadian community that can play an active role as we deepen relations. Oftentimes, members of the diaspora are also part of the chambers of commerce and business associations, and they're one of the first ones to go into new markets. So, for instance, we just signed a CEPA with Indonesia, and we're hoping that at that Chamber of Commerce and the Indonesian Canadians can be part of that effort as well. But I also would like to note that it needs to be a whole of Canada approach. Obviously, we need to draw on the talents of our diaspora community, but we cannot exercise foreign policy through diaspora only. I think we need to make sure that our universities and Canadians travel to the region much more, take advantage of the scholarships that are available through the Indo-Pacific strategy, and this becomes a whole of nation, whole of society effort.
I
think that the people listening to us now would find that the Indo-Pacific region presents an issue or a certain choice. The polarization that we have seen. What should the choice be? For example, the choice between China or the United States, two strong powers. And so in terms of Canada as a middle power, how can we be an intervener? How can we be a participant? How can we present neutrality, but maintaining a solid, firm position?
If you want to come in, I'm happy to.
I can answer. I think it's very dangerous to create this type of a discourse, that is to say, competition with the United States and China. There are other actors, including Canada and Japan. I think that it's a question about an open society that respects human rights, international law, the rule of law that is universal. I think this is how we have to see it in that spirit. Our partners who share those same values are important, like Taiwan. Yes, but so if I understand what you're saying, it's a coalition? It's a group, but it's a group not so much to support an alliance with the United States, but to promote democratic rights and interests everywhere. So that doesn't exclude anyone. Thank you.
To all the witnesses today to appear before the committee and for your flexibility in helping make this discussion possible. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much once again. We will now proceed in camera for the second portion of the meeting. We suspend.
Merci.